everybody. Like that little sugar high, little snacks. Always good. Okay. Just a quick reminder, too, the next break that we take will be the last break to get signs, merchandise, T-shirts, all of that. That'll be at the next break. That'll be the last time to do that. And remember, there are a lot of the yard signs, so the more that you all take, the less the crew has to take back to our office. They're great for your shelters, your businesses, your home. I plan on taking 4, so leave me that, okay? They last about a year for me, and then I have to replace them, so. Okay, here we go. This next session is Unmasking Animal Hoarding. We all see that, right? Happens way too often, so let's become more knowledgeable about it. Unmasking Animal Hoarding, Effective Strategies and Solutions. Our speaker today, we're honored to have Adam Leath with us. He is Senior Director of Collaborative Initiatives at Jacksonville Humane Society, leading statewide programs that support shelters and respond to cruelty and disaster cases. Formerly with the ASPCA, he has led major national investigations and animal seizures. Adam is also an educator and expert in animal cruelty investigations. So let's welcome Adam Leath.
Thank you, Buffy. Thank you, Buffy, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I know that they put me after lunch. That's by design. Hopefully you're all going to finish up your snack. I will join you in just putting a bit of a disclaimer out there. The subject matter that we're going to discuss today is very emotional. It can invoke a lot of reactions, but my point today is to present this topic through a bit of an objective lens so that we can kind of look at what does the studies say and maybe some examples of what could happen in communities across the country. So I'm going to jump right in. Thank you for that, Buffy. So my name is Adam Leath. I've been here 20 years now in animal welfare. I've led 3 municipal and 3 nonprofit animal welfare organizations. I was fortunate enough to be the Southeast Regional Director for the ASPCA, where I was a subject matter expert for law enforcement, prosecutors, animal control, and the courts for many years before continuing that work at the local level. Because let's face it, the difference made for animals is at the local level, and for me, that's why I enjoy it the most. I am a lifelong learner. I spend a lot of my time learning as much as I do teaching. Currently, I am sitting on the board of the International Society for Animal Forensic Science, as well as the National Animal Care and Control Association, which is who I'm coming for today. So if you have questions about what sort of professional associations exist and how they might be able to help you when you interact with some individual that might be a hoarding case around the corner, we want to be a resource for you. So what does that look like? I'm from Jacksonville, so this is our shelter. If you've never been there, I would encourage you to come. We have what's referred to as Life Saving University, which we extend to municipal and nonprofit partners. So that is our facility. So I work in the 67 counties in the state of Florida, spending all of my time within each of these shelters, tackling the challenges that they're dealing with. And hoarding comes up a lot. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, how many of you know that there are types of hoarders? Anyone ever knew that, heard about that? A few, okay. How many of you are municipal in the room or a nonprofit with a municipal contract? Just curious, okay. And the rest, I presume, are nonprofits primarily. There will be a lot of what I will focus on today that will focus a lot on the investigative steps, some of the things that might happen in terms of the investigation. And whether you're a nonprofit or you're municipal, all of us play a role in being able to ensure that these cases get positive outcomes. So pay particular attention, because even though it may be focused on investigating, does not mean that the investigation can happen without partnerships, especially those partnerships with other nonprofits in the community. So we're going to talk about the types of animal hoarders. There's also some very distinct motivations behind animal hoarding, and those differ depending upon the individual. We're also going to talk about intervention strategies, looking at how can we get these individuals to stop doing what they're doing. Have you ever heard of recidivism? Happens every day, right? Especially in animal hoarding cases. Why is it that they just keep coming back and doing the same thing? And what can we do? We're also going to talk about how animal hoarding impacts other agencies. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with how that impacts you, but may not necessarily have an appreciation for how you can fill those gaps if you end up running into a situation where you may not have all the resources that you need. And then we're also going to look at the 5 freedoms. How can the 5 freedoms, I've heard a couple of presentations mention the 5 freedoms, but we can also use the 5 freedoms as a tool to identify an appropriate intervention strategy for hoarders. If you have ever interacted with one, many of you, I'm sure, are going to see a lot of the same things that you've seen in your own cases, but I want you to look at it through a bit of a different lens. Why are they doing it? What is their particular motivation? And then how can you use that as a lever to potentially get them to stop doing what they're doing? And then lastly, we're going to explore an animal hoarding case of a rescue hoarder that kind of went bad. So what that can look like in your community. So what is animal hoarding? Well, I can tell you that everyone has a little bit of their own definition. I'm sure you all know what hoarding smells like. I'm sure you know what the shelter feels like post-hoarding case, right? But what is animal hoarding? There's actually a great deal of research. In fact, first was Dr. Gary Petronik in 1999, went through and described what animal hoarders are. And it is when an individual might accumulate large numbers of animals, when they fail to provide minimum standards of care, that's in sanitation, nutrition, or even veterinary care, fail to act when the animal's environment continues to deteriorate, and then fails to recognize that impact on their own welfare. I kind of refer to it as the paralysis of analysis. If any of you have ever worked with hoarders, when you ask them questions about, hey, let's go ahead and help these cats, they might need some care, it's, well, I would love to do that, except that person just recently quit, or gosh, I just had that many more cats come in yesterday, or I had a death in the family. There's always this, I can't do it, and I'm going to do it tomorrow, except tomorrow never comes. So I kind of think of it as the paralysis of analysis. If they truly had the ability to conceptualize everything that's going on in their environment, it would be a bad day. The brain's a pretty tricky thing, and over long periods of time, I mean, these cases don't happen overnight. They take years to accumulate in some situations. Imagine what the mind must go through in order to go into that environment day in and day out and somehow rationalize and normalize. Most of us wouldn't be able to do it, right? But for them, it's a survival technique, because otherwise they would truly have a mental breakdown. So what is animal hoarding not considered? Animal hoarding is not a community cat caretaker or individuals who are feeding community cats or those that are trapping community cats. And I say usually, I've had some hoarders who actually did participate in community cat activities, but those are not common. And if any individuals who are working to help community cats in their community does not mean that all those cats are theirs, so that's not what we're talking about. We're also not talking about breeders or puppy mills. While there is likely a lot of nefarious activity that's potentially happening in those environments, their motivation, the individual who decided that I'm going to breed these animals, is a very different motivation from an individual who's an animal hoarder. So there's a very different characteristics. They're also not an over-the-limit pet owner. Do you have pet limits here anywhere in the state of Indiana? There are a few, right? So if someone has one more than what you're allowed, that doesn't mean suddenly they're a hoarder. In fact, it's actually best that we just focus on the individual care. Are you providing the care or are you not providing the care? That's typically where we're identifying whether it is a hoarding case. And then we're not talking about animal exhibitors. Do you guys see many of those here? These are the roadside zoos, the petting zoos, those types of things. We get a lot of them in Florida. There's a reason why they call it Florida Man. We have a lot of those examples. We've had elephants get loose. I mean, all kinds of bizarre things. But it is also not legitimate animal rescue groups or shelters. Now, while there may be individuals who claim that they are providing reasonable care, but in fact are hoarding, their motivation, we're going to go into that in a moment, their motivation clearly articulates that they are past their capacity to provide reasonable care. And that's not what we're talking about today. These individuals who are legitimate animal rescue and legitimate shelters have lots of animals, right? Boarding facilities, veterinary clinics. Just because they have large numbers of kennels doesn't mean that they're suddenly hoarding animals. However, what does the public think animal hoarding is? Anybody know who the picture in the middle, you know who that is? Anybody know? Anybody know her name? The crazy cat lady is what everyone remembers, but her name in the show, and I'm not making it up, her name is Eleanor Abernathy. She has her medical degree from Yale and her Juris Doctorate from Harvard. She was 23. She started to become more isolated, and she became best friends with her cat named Snowball. And next thing you know, she starts accumulating cats. So it probably isn't that far away from the truth, but it's what the popular belief might be from the community. I'm sure everyone has seen the crazy cat action figure, complete with the cats and the hair and opposable cat figures. What about all the way to the right? You ever seen the game by Archie McPhee called The Crazy Cat Lady? The mission of this game, if any of you are interested after the conference today, is to go around the board and collect as many cats as you possibly can before you get caught by animal control. I'm not making it up. But our community might actually believe that that's what we're talking about, right? And as crazy as this might be, it's not that far off. There is a thread of truth in what we're talking about, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But it's important to recognize that these are the beliefs and the common misconceptions of the public. So what happens when you're trying to prosecute a hoarder, and we're going to talk a lot about that, and they're the ones that jump to the media first. And they want to talk about how awful you are, and how awful you didn't provide reasonable care, and how you just big bad government, and all you're interested in is euthanizing all of my animals. Might be a little challenging for you to overcome that. So for hoarders, predominantly they are women. Studies show that the vast majority are women who are unmarried, generally between 50 and 59. They are also, all income levels are represented, which is something else that I was surprised by before I was getting into this, is how many of these individuals, you wouldn't expect if someone has a large net worth that they would be hoarding, but in fact it actually is represented among all income levels. So the picture you see to the right is actually a call. This was EMS. They had called animal services because the individual in the home had fallen and broken their hip. Medical emergency, EMS, gotta go, right? They pick up the two-legged victim and off to the hospital. Now it becomes whose problem? Animal services, right? Except when we take all the animals away and then we go, whose problem does it become? Code enforcement, don't forget that. So the minute that all of them are quick to point that it's an animal issue, so therefore it should be all animal services issue, if you remove the animals from these situations, it is a code enforcement issue. So all of us have an equal responsibility to be able to respond and appropriately provide reasonable outcomes. All right, so this was a study of 49 cases. This was Dr. Gary Petronik in '99. Kind of looked at what was the individual housing like for all of these animal hoarders. And they found that over 77% had heavily cluttered and unsanitary conditions. Particularly concerning is the amount of deceased animals that were found in these environments. Many of them didn't have working facilities. Things were not used as for their intended purpose, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. There's no working refrigerator, the heat may not work. Imagine how easy it might be for a hoarder to invite someone over for dinner on Friday night. Do you think that happens? Not regularly. So this becomes continually self-isolating for them. It becomes worse over time. So interestingly enough, another study in Stump et al. They looked at 538 individuals with animal hoarding and found that the majority were middle-aged, unmarried women. Most had unsanitary conditions with 13 to 41% recidivism rates. Pretty high. And cats and dogs were hoarded most often. And they were mostly acquired through unplanned breeding. And then 60% of them contained deceased animals in that study as well. So we can already see that this is big impact to the animals in our community. In fact, most of the time, what gets the most attention in your community? What does the news typically feature most when it comes to something with an animal? It's advertising, as we heard earlier from Gina. We talk about the cruelty, we talk about the neglect, right? The individual things that happen to this animal. Someone did this horrible, terrible, awful thing. Except by the numbers, more animals are at risk in hoarding cases than any other intentional act on an animal, period. By the numbers, more animals suffer in hoarding cases than any other type of case. So it's imperative that we identify what these triggers are and what we can do to respond appropriately. So clutter really prevents or hinders their living spaces for their intended purposes. So we no longer can use the stove to cook. We can't use the bathroom to freshen up. All of these things continue as the environment starts to deteriorate. The study also found that in these 49 cases, the hoarder couldn't cook or enjoy meals. They had piles of stuff blocking their usage. They couldn't shower. And they may or not even be able to use their own bed. And imagine, and at least for me, on the human side, we talk about having compassion at both ends of the leash. Imagine how that must be for the individual, whether they have the awareness of what it is or not. Many examples I've had in the cases that I've worked, we can't be in animal welfare without having some compassion for the people. And I struggle, and I think probably what most fascinates me about this is I had an aunt who was afflicted. And so growing up, we always struggled. Every couple of years, we would empty everything out of the home. And in very rural Tennessee, not a lot of resources. Magically, it continued to come back over and over again. So we've got to start addressing these issues in a more holistic response and then give some options on what we can do to fix it. So this is just one example. So this is a mobile home, and this is the kitchen. So I ask you, how many things do you see in this photo? Gosh, it's kind of hard to even see, right? So if you look back on here, we have a cat, right? Probably don't immediately see the cat, and in our world, we always look for the animals. But can we use most of what this is designed for its intended purpose? Obviously not. Same here. What room in the house is this? Bathroom. And the only way you know that is the tile. Otherwise, it might function as a closet. It certainly isn't functioning as a bathroom. So it's important for us to look at the types of animal hoarders, and there's 3 distinct types. The first is the overwhelmed caregiver. And by and large, I hope that the individual who I'm talking to in a hoarding case is an overwhelmed caregiver. Why? Because they're the most likely to accept help from us. They're most likely to accept help, and I'm likely to be able to give them help and reduce harm. These cases have to be approached with the ability to reduce harm. We're not going to be able to fix this overnight, and in most situations it's impossible, but how can we reduce harm? So for overwhelmed caregivers, they do have awareness of their problems. They typically don't minimize it. They have their problems triggered by a change in circumstance or health or finance. They do have a strong attachment to the animals, which is something that I use very frequently. If I know that I'm dealing with an overwhelmed caregiver and I know that they have an attachment to the animals, well, then why not bring a veterinarian with me on my first initial response to say, I got some individuals in your neighborhood who said that you might need some help, so I brought my vet. Would my vet be able to take a look at your animals? Well, they probably are going to agree. They're probably going to be more likely to work with us, and I'm reducing harm. And if in that entire time they decide to tell me to go fly a kite or tell me that they don't want my resources anymore, well, guess what? I have all the probable cause I need because my vet just examined all their animals. So we still have a backup plan. And I think a lot of times organizations struggle because they think if we're giving resources, we're somehow condoning what's happening. And that's not the case. We can give resources and reduce harm in most of these cases and ultimately have a better outcome for the animals and have a better outcome for the individual. So lastly, they do have a lot of psychological disorders that are oftentimes undiagnosed and undertreated. There is in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, hoarding disorder is listed. And many of us don't have psychologists or psychiatrists working on our staff, right? So we're not going to be walking in and diagnosing people with things. But we are going to be asking open-ended questions, coming with an empathetic ear, and trying to understand what might be happening. This would be that same example of the mobile home that I told you earlier. So this was, she had over 40 cats in this particular, it was a mobile, it was actually a bumper-mounted trailer, and there was nothing in this facility that worked. She was completely isolated, had no family, and so in these situations, do we think that us showing up, taking all of the animals, charging her, taking the mobile home to the dump, and then wiping our hands and hoping that everything goes away. That's probably the best way for us to handle that? But is it the way that we have been handling it? I mean, without resources, sometimes that is the way that it's handled. This is another example. This was a case where, if you don't see the animal first off in the picture, you know that there's probably an indication there's an issue. I didn't even know there was a dog in this home. There were what they refer to as goat paths, and I'm not making that up. So Dr. Randy Frost talked about it in his book, Stuff. So they will literally have goat paths, so small enough just for them to be able to move around the home. So I just heard rustling everywhere in the house. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And luckily the dog was very sociable, but clearly an issue. It was an overwhelmed caregiver, again, triggered a set of circumstances that they were unable to overcome. The next is the rescue hoarder. And for them, they are incredibly challenging for us to work with. They have a sense of mission to save and are compelled to be able to save. Typically, that's triggered by a compulsive need to acquire to avoid euthanasia. So a lot of rescue hoarders will troll euthanasia lists for shelters that do post those. They will frequently actively acquire animals. Versus our overwhelmed caregiver is actually acquiring animals passively. Typically with a lack of spay-neuter, they don't have the resources they need. Rescue hoarders are actively trying to acquire animals from many different sources. They have a fear of death, and they adamantly oppose euthanasia, and oftentimes believe that their knowledge is superior to anyone else. In fact, I've had one, we'll see in a moment, in this example where the hoarder was going on the television talking about how much of an expert they were in animal welfare and how many years that they had done it. And to the lay person, how would they know any different? General public didn't go in their home. They didn't get to see how bad it was. It becomes really sticky for the organization to not only maintain the PR side, but also the animal welfare side. They also avoid or even impede any legitimate attempt for authority to provide resources. In fact, they actually have a kind of a network of enablers. If you've ever worked with a rescue hoarder and you notice that suddenly they don't have any animals on day of inspection, or you notice that they have a lot fewer animals in a short period of time, many of them will transfer back and forth if they know that there's potential undue attention by authorities by what they're doing. This is an example. This was a rescue called Wishbone Animal Rescue. So they were actively soliciting for donations from the public. As you can see at the front porch, we have almost every type of animal-related item that you could think of. And this was a single-family residence. How many of you think that the neighbors on both sides had a few things to say about this? Sure. Along with the driveway, when I walked up to do just general response, we've got someone who was dropping off their cat in the wire crate. We've got all kinds of animal-related items stored outdoors, which is one of the telltale signs and the hallmarks of what we look for. And then the last is probably the most difficult. And I've only had a few, and I'm glad, because I think if I had more, it would be more challenging to get through. But exploiter hoarders are probably the most litigious and the most challenging to work with. They actively acquire animals to serve their own needs. So rather than having a connection to the animals or wanting to get animals because they're afraid that euthanasia would happen, like in the overwhelmed caregiver and the rescue hoarder, exploiter hoarders get the animals purely to service their own needs. By that I mean they want money and they think animals might be an easy way to do it, and many people donate for animal causes, so let me try to get more money and I'm not going to provide any care for the animals. These individuals oftentimes will even sue organizations, and I've had a couple do that as well. They also lack empathy. They lack empathy for the animals, they lack empathy for you, and they really reject any attempt for you to provide resources. And ultimately, they believe that their knowledge is superior to everyone else. In fact, they've even adopted the role of expert. You probably don't have any animals running loose in these areas in their neighborhood. They're actively acquiring as many as they possibly can. This is an example. This was actually a call that we didn't know anything about at the time, but it turned out because it was a fire. So part of the residence had caught on fire. But before we even get there, what would you first of all see here? What do we see in the red? Yeah, I mean, any of you think about this when you first roll up? Hey, hold on a second. I'm about to interrupt this person's life. They're doing something totally different than probably what they're about to have to do, which is to deal with me. What do I know about them? Well, unless they are stealing someone else's trash, they're using cat litter. They've got empty cat litter pails, right? There's a lot of signs. We don't call 911, keep out. So is it likely that this person is going to be immediately receptive or open? Probably not. So I'm going to immediately be on the defensive to be looking for ways to reduce their tension. It's not always easy, but right away I would be on alert. I would be looking for any animals in and around that area. We're going to talk about how these are investigated as well. But inside of the home, again, we see just about, this is just right inside that privacy fence. You can see just how many animal-related items. You would never know that just driving by the front of the residence necessarily because there was a privacy fence. So rarely in these cases is there even enough for law enforcement or animal control to go in, even in legitimate cases where animals are intentionally being abused. Getting probable cause for a warrant, that threshold is not easy. And it's certainly challenging when all you see is the outside of the house, because they're not going to open the front door and say, come on in, let me show you this cool science project I've been working on for the last 10 years. Most of the time, they're going to slam the door, not come to you at all. But in this situation, it was pretty apparent that it had been going on and chronically for quite some period of time. They were actually soliciting individuals for transfer from lots of different rescues and other shelters, and the home caught on fire, and during that time we found a number of deceased animals. Ultimately was charged, but this was one that we didn't know anything about. It just happened to, again, be called in because it was a fire at the home. So the things that make me lay awake at night is not the ones that I know about, it's the ones that I don't know about. It's the ones that didn't get called in. So is animal hoarding a crime? How many of you have animal hoarding anywhere in your ordinance? The words animal hoarding, okay? Not many, okay? And I would argue that it's probably not serving you to have it there because you're not diagnosing individuals, so it's not considered a best practice. And in fact, there is still one state in Illinois that has it in their state statute. Thankfully, Hawaii removed it from theirs, but we're not mental health professionals. We deal with a lot of people who are suffering from crisis, but we're not mental health professionals. So we shouldn't be labeling individuals or trying to say that the crime is that they're hoarding animals. No, the crime is the individual care that's provided to those animals, which we have a great deal of statutes for and can use to help. So the crime in the majority of your jurisdictions is actually just the neglect or the cruelty that's taking place. They're very situation specific. And then depending upon the type of hoarder, it actually might not be the best to do criminal. You could actually do non-criminal interventions as well. So health concerns. How many of you have responded to a case, been in a hoarded home? What were you wearing? Oh, PPE, okay. What sort of PPE are we wearing? Hazmat suits. I have a few people, it depends on how bad it is. What about your footwear? Any of you ever fallen through the floor? When you're of my size, you fall through everything, so they usually make you go in first. They also make you put on the Tyvek suits first too, because they give you the smaller size and it looks like a razor blade down a hot dog on the back side of it when I put them on. But yes, health concerns everywhere. This is actually a photo from a case that I did early in my career. The individual here, his parents died and left him their home and all their worldly possessions, along with the two cats. Unfortunately, that the cats were of opposite sex, and 2 became 200 in about 4 years. And so you can actually barely see the outline of the couch in the background, but it is completely entombed. The environment that's created from these create lots of problems for you, and particularly the ammonia and the amount of ammonia can actually destroy the cilia in human lungs just by being in that environment. So coordinating with those in your area about law enforcement, fire department, could you get exhaust fans in these environments? Could you try to vet this out and make this a safe environment before you go in? That's certainly what I would recommend. All right, so there are a lot of zoonotic diseases. This is not by any means a comprehensive list, but the number, these are animals that are highly under-socialized because of the way in which they were housed. They likely receive little or no intervention medically. So would it surprise you to say that they're probably one of the most immunocompromised and disease pathogened animals that exist on the world is in these hoarding houses. So the hantavirus, if any of you have ever had to deal with those types of situations before. Rat excrement can pass all kinds of different things. Lepto is a concern that we have that's passed through animal urine. Ringworm, as we all know, how that's passed is very common in these environments. It's also not uncommon to be dealing with cat scratch fever, especially as staff members are interacting and potentially becoming exposed to the cats through bites or scratches. And then certainly rabies is always a concern. So we want to make sure that we're wearing the appropriate PPE, securing the footwear, securing a fresh air supply, securing a Tyvek suit, and then working with those hazmat teams. Many of you may not realize this if you haven't already. You can work with your fire departments. All of them have a specialty unit. They're hazmat teams, so if a load of chemicals falls off the freeway tonight and there's a mass response, there is a hazardous materials team at the fire department whose job it is to respond to those. They are dealing with very noxious fumes. They're dealing with very unsanitary conditions. I've always found them to be very helpful to not only help us measure what type of ammonia and how high parts per billion it is in there, parts per million it is in there, but also fanning it, just trying to make it easier for us to be able to get in and out. So how does it affect other agencies? I think most of us in this room can probably appreciate that we don't have a lot of capacity at the shelter on a day-to-day basis. And so we certainly don't have 30 or 40 kennels that we can devote to victims of hoarding all at one moment. So trying to be able to manage these types of situations, I've always encouraged to not only reduce the harm, but we can reduce the numbers while they're in the home. And when we talk about the intervention strategies, I would try to find ways of keeping animals, because they're going to keep getting more. So if the environment is not such that we can't fix it, and that says a lot, we might be able to help them and help some of the animals and be able to allow them to maintain animals in the future. In some instances, that's not possible and that's not appropriate, and we're going to talk about the differences. So even if space is found to house the animals, the cost is exorbitant. You heard Tristan McMillan talk about it a moment ago. At the ASPCA, we had a number of large-scale seizures. If you're ever interested in looking at one, Caboodle Ranch is one that you probably should look at. This was an individual who had 692 cats on a 40-acre piece of property in Madison County, Florida. The ASPCA spent $4.1 million to house all 692 of those cats, which after they gave birth was over 750. And so we had to house them for 6 months. And the only way we were able to do that is to find a shelter elsewhere. A new shelter had just been built, so an old shelter we found and put them all there. It's exorbitant. We don't have additional space. We also don't have additional funds to be able to provide in these situations. So what happens when it happens to you? That's where your contacts are important. That's where your NGOs, that's where your local partners, all of us working together, taking a little small piece of it, makes it much more manageable than one or two organizations trying to do everything. And remember that the animals are evidence, and they are evidence in a criminal case, so we have to document them as such. And so in the structuring, there's an interdisciplinary responses for hoarding. The Hoarding of Animals Research Consortium out of Tufts, which is a great resource for you if you haven't taken a look at that. They take a look at the types of intervention strategies for hoarder types. And what this actually does, and it's circled here to the right, is in prosecution, notice that we're really only recommending prosecution for most of the time exploiter hoarders. We might actually use prosecution as a last resort in some of the other cases, but you can actually see that in cases of overwhelmed caregivers, it's actually not considered appropriate response. If we know that charging them is not going to fix it, because ultimately this as an underlying mental health concern, then why would we be charging them? Why wouldn't we work directly with them? If you've ever gotten called, have any of you gotten friendly with your hoarders? I had many of them that thought I was their best friend. And I did that intentionally because I wanted to know. I had them call me when a new animal came in, or they had the urge to get another one. It's a lot of work, but when you can get to that level and to that level of trust with some of the overwhelmed caregivers, you're likely to find that they're not going to continue to go back or to continue to go back with the same severity. This looks at the 5 freedoms, as we've talked about earlier. So along the top, you can kind of see there the freedom from hunger and thirst, injury and disease, the fear from distress and any discomfort. All of the concerns that we have for animals Here is the competent caregiving. And as we notice that as we start to remove freedoms, we start seeing that the quality of life suffers, and the quality of life is impacted significantly. And typically when we're talking about charging someone in these cases with animal cruelty, we're really looking at this box at the bottom. And that is the life is not worth living, and the animals really have no 5 freedoms, not a single one of them being provided. All the rest of it is a continuum. So could we maybe help them provide better care? Could we help them reduce? Could we continue to develop a rapport with them? I found that that's been very successful in getting them to ultimately do what we're asking them to do. So because we've talked about them being criminal and non-criminal, I'm going to devote a little bit of time to talking about the criminal side, because there is a need for us to use criminal prosecution in these cases, especially in exploiter hoarders, because we want to limit their ability to have animals. How many of you have had a judge order someone not to have contact with animals in the future? Okay. How many of you think that that's forever? Okay. How many of you think that that actually might be enforceable outside of Indianapolis? No judge has jurisdiction over someone's entire life and all geographic areas in the United States. So if they move to another jurisdiction, if they're not on probation, or they move to another state, animals are considered property. It is very easy for them to acquire animals. So we want to try to figure out how can we reduce them, and in exploiter hoarders, charging them is really the best. So we really want to identify who's coming and going from the property. How many of you think that Amazon knows more about you than your neighbor does? They know all about you, right? Who do you think knows the most about you? The trash guy. Yeah, the trash woman. Whoever it is, solid waste, right? You ever want to know anything about people? Go through their trash. As someone who does it on a regular basis for work, right? No direct stares here. It's important because we find out a treasure trove of information about them. So we want to talk to neighbors. We want to actually see if they're a 501c3. It might be that if they're a rescue hoarder, they may be taking advantage of the tax-exempt status, and many do. Following the money is a really good way for rescue hoarders to change their behavior. As soon as you can find that they're soliciting donations and have fraudulent activity associated with it, we're talking about higher level crimes in many jurisdictions. So how do we do this? How do we conduct it? Well, ultimately we want to use online databases as much as possible. That could include your property appraiser's office, your tax collector. Do many of you look at that on a regular basis? Who may live there? Who owns the property? Those are really useful tools, because if we know who we're dealing with ahead of time, might we do some additional research? They could have an active case in another jurisdiction. There may be an active case with your organization, and another officer responded several days earlier. So we want to make sure that we're utilizing databases, any available database that includes your own organization's database. Is there any history? Does your organization or your neighboring jurisdictions have history with this individual? We also want to look at the electric company. Someone is going to pay the electric bill, and most people don't pay others' electric bills. So if you're paying the electric bill for this house, might it be that you're the one living there? Most of the time, not always, but most of the time. Same for water and cable, any service providers. We really want to utilize the expertise of even law enforcement. How many of you have worked with law enforcement and been able to let them go through? They can pull up information in their databases. Maybe they were there the day before for a domestic situation. Talk about safety. These situations don't happen in a bubble. Law enforcement may have history at that address or not, but if we don't ask, we won't know. I'll point your attention to the picture to the right. So this is Gail Andrews. Miss Andrews lives in a very nice house on one of the most ritzy areas in Southwest Florida, McGregor Boulevard. It's actually where the Edison Ford Winter Estate is, if you've never been in that area. We got the call. This was the house in the front. And we didn't know anything about Gail Andrews, but we hadn't had any calls out to her house, nothing related to animal services. But law enforcement had indicated to us that the Social Security Administration had gone quite worried that her mom, who by their estimation was 115 years old, hadn't been seen in a while. Yet somehow those checks grew legs and made their way to the bank every month without fail. So the concern was she hadn't been seen in a while, but Miss Andrews, who had been talking to her neighbors a lot. In fact, her neighbor next door told me, she said, yeah, it was really weird. She came over yesterday and said, hey, would it be okay if I slept in your kid's treehouse? And I'm like, what, who, wow. Like, if you don't know your neighbor and you walk up and you ask them if you can sleep in their kid's treehouse, lots of questions I have. But she said that the refrigerator had broken and that the smell was getting to her, and the next door neighbor felt sorry for her and allowed her to start sleeping in the treehouse. So inside the home, however, was a bit of a different story. As we started moving things around, you can see this is actually tuna fish cans. There are thousands of them. She was using tuna fish to hand feed rodents, like just rats from the community, in her house. It was really strange because when you walked up, they didn't run from you. They were all just kind of hanging out, just wanting to, I don't know, sing you a chorus or something. It was very strange. We also found the remains of her mother between the mattress and box springs, the only bed in the entire home. In fact, that is Mom's cranium and her mandible. Had no idea. We actually couldn't find all of her. Most of the smaller appendages had been carried off into the home. How many of you expect that, right? I didn't either. So these kinds of situations have a tendency to come up in the most inopportune times and oftentimes stretch your resources to the max. So how can we deal with these issues earlier on? How many of you know that you have a hoarder in your community right now? Okay? And I'm not going to ask you, but if you don't have a strategy for how to deal with it, it's going to get worse. And it's going to get exponentially worse the longer it goes in time. So if we look for indications outside the home, I used to do this all the time. I don't do it quite as much anymore, but I hang out at the cat food aisle on the grocery store when I go shopping. And I look around and I listen because I've found lots of people who need help in the cat food aisle. And many of them have more cats than they need at home. Their vehicle also looks like that. You can see to the bottom right. Typically, it's mobile. It's not only the home, it's also the vehicle as well. But kind of going back, when you drive by this pile of potential trash, if any of you that have worked in the communities, how many of you stop to see what it is? Probably wouldn't think twice to just walk right by that. Most of us wouldn't do that, right? Except if we're concerned that maybe the neighbors constantly keep complaining about loose cats everywhere, and we notice that there's, I don't know how many years worth of paper bags of cat food that have been left outside and completely disintegrate. That's what it looks like. So lots of animal-related items that we immediately indicated that there was a concern and then wanted to start and open a case to provide resources. So the physical signs, when we're lucky, they're out there. This was a case of an exploiter hoarder as well. He was actually accepting animals for $70. You could bring any animals, including the circus would bring animals, their retired circus dogs, many others, $70, no questions asked, all inside of a single family home. And you could imagine what it looked like by the time that we executed the warrant and charged him criminally. We also have no signs. We'll go back to the picture we talked about at the beginning of the presentation here. There were 80 cats inside of this home where the homeowner had fallen and broken their hip. We wouldn't know anything about that. You would drive right by that house and nothing would stand out to you. Nothing would seem strange about that, right? So it's not always that there are physical signs outside, but if there are physical signs outside, maybe we should dig a little further. So communication is key. I like to, and in fact what I recommend that people do, is try to prove people right. So people always say, oh, they lie to us all the time, you know, at the front desk, they lie to us. Well, maybe, but if you can try to prove someone right first, you're hearing what they're saying, and if what they're saying doesn't add up, you don't have to call them a liar, right? You know that what they're telling you doesn't line up. And in this situation, that's what happens. In hoarding cases, I want to work toward compliance first. I want to legitimately offer them resources. Veterinarians are an amazing resource in these situations because they can show up and identify, they can triage, we can potentially reduce harm. Maybe there are some animals that are reasonable to stay in the environment. So could we vaccinate them? Maybe we can go ahead and start sterilizing them so that we're not waiting for months and multiple litters between the time that we originally responded to some point in the future. We want to keep working with them, so reduce the harm ultimately. We want to utilize enforcement last. Really utilizing probable cause as serving a search warrant is challenging, especially when there are no signs out there. So here's what that looks like. Here's what I do. I go out, if I'm responding to a call that I think that maybe there's hoarding going on, I'll go to the local store and buy the largest bag of dog food or cat food I can possibly find. 50, 60 pounds, as heavy as I can possibly get it. And there's a tactic for that. I want to be the best friend. I want to show up with a really heavy bag that I know they can't carry, that I'm going to volunteer to carry in there for them. Hey, could I carry this in for your cats, your dogs? I know you clearly care about them. Could I bring that into the home? And then I can look to see what's inside. It works a lot of times, especially for overwhelmed caregivers. So I want to work and provide them with resources until they're not willing to provide or not willing to accept them. And ultimately, if they stop providing care for the animals or stop receiving the resources, then I'm going to move to criminal prosecution, and I'll let them know that. All right, so this is not a class on search warrants, but let me just tell you, voluntary versus consent, voluntary and search warrant, consent for a search warrant or voluntary and search warrants are both very valuable tools, but they take a lot of time. Law enforcement has only 2 tools to lawfully enter a property. They only can enter if they're given consent or if the courts have given them permission. How long does it take to get a search warrant? Anyone ever been involved in that? Yeah, just pretty quick, right? Like going out here and grabbing a cup of coffee. Sure. What if we were able to talk to them and get in the house without having to have the warrant? It's much easier. It can also shorten my time. If I know that there's potential for animals, suffering, I want to be able to move as quickly as I can. I don't want to have to wait unnecessarily. But if they don't want us in the house and they don't give us consent, we are going to work toward compliance first and then later use enforcement when necessary. So planning ahead, how many of you know how many animals you can safely transport at any given time at your organization? You ever had to challenge that? You ever had a tabletop with that? How many animals can you humanely transport from any location to another location? Homework assignment, find out. And here's why. The next time that you have a hoarding case, because it will happen to you, hopefully it's not today. I've had that happen one other conference. But if it happens, you need to be able to know what resources you have in your own backyard. And you also need to kind of know who your friends are. Who are your neighboring jurisdictions? Because you might find that there's resources in the county next door or the nonprofit next door that could help offset some of these issues. Especially if the animals are surrendered, then the nonprofit or the municipal can move forward with disposition. And you're going to need as many people as you can to help in that process. So ultimately, the many states, including Florida, I don't know if Indiana does. I needed to look at that. If you exempt veterinarians from civil liability for helping you in a criminal case, many states do that. And especially if you don't have a veterinarian at your shelter, could you go and work with a veterinarian in your community? You could. And it's helpful if you can tell them, oh, and by the way, if you help me, don't worry about getting sued. There's some protection for you. So it's important that we mention that. And we have to anticipate what resources we're going to need. And the veterinarian is one of the chief among these. We have to identify a veterinarian and work with them on these cases. You cannot achieve a positive outcome in hoarding cases without having a veterinarian involved. And I would I would advocate for them to be involved from the very beginning, even from the initial scene responses if possible. All right, so seizing animals. If we are having to seize animals, we have to make sure that they're documented because we have to recreate their conditions later. How many of you have ever successfully charged someone, hoarder, for misdemeanor or felony level cruelty? How difficult is that? Slow? Difficult? So in order for us to secure the resources that we need, we've got to identify what we might need first, which comes from the scene. After we identify what resources we need, do we have those? Maybe we have some of them, but we don't have all of them. Now we're going to talk about seizing the animals. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is sheltering and caring for them. I work with a lot of different agencies, and many of them are like, okay, we just need to get the warrant, and then we'll get the animals. Hold on a minute. Like, let's not even talk about touching animals yet. Let's figure out what would happen if you had to bring 40 dogs into your shelter today. What would you do? Because we can't take them from a bad situation and then put them into a worse situation, or one that could be perceived as worse. So if the animals are seized during the course of the investigation, we really need to make sure that we're photographing them. Animals are like a box. We should treat them as that. How many sides does a box have? 6, thank you, yes. So 6 sides. So ventral, dorsal, dorsal, ventral. We want to make sure that we're photographing them from the top down and the bottom up, as well as all 4 sides. We want to make sure that we can tell the judge, the jury, this is the condition that we found to this animal, because they're not going to ask the animals to come into court. I've done this 20 years now, I've never had the court allow me to bring an animal victim into trial. It would likely never happen. So the best documentation we have is what we took when we brought the animals into care. We also want to make sure that we're preserving their condition as true as possible. Don't run down the line and try to provide food and water for all of these animals at the scene. Please don't do that. All the blood values, their hydration level, all the things that we're going to want to test for and the veterinarians are going to want to document are drastically changed the minute that you're providing them with food and water at that scene. So if we're talking about serving a warrant and seizing animals, we're not going to be going down and giving them food and water at the scene. We're going to be working as quickly and efficiently as possible to get them from the scene back to the shelter. Once they're examined, would we then provide them with food and water? Because we want to collect blood and feces and urine and all the things that can tell a very compelling story before we've changed the animal pretty dramatically. So now that we know what hoarding is, let's talk about how classic approaches don't work. And I don't want any of you to feel bad about this, because I myself have done many of these types of situations before and guilty of doing the same thing. So classic approaches are ineffective. They ultimately don't resolve the problem. One of them is ignoring it. That case I talked to you about with the 692 cats in Caboodle Ranch, they said, well, it's just too big. We can't handle that. Well, then who does? Because you still take tax dollars, like someone's got to do it. So it's too big to fail, ignoring the problem, or passing it on to another agency. I used to hate when they would say, oh, it's animals, so animal services, you can deal with it. I had a PIO that I loved. She would always tell us, it can't be no one's job. Because we would literally hear all the time, well, it's not us, it's not us, it's not, well, who is it? Because I'm trying to work to find a solution here. It can't be no one's job. We also don't want to wait until the problem becomes a criminal offense before we do something. I've had a number of individuals who've expressed frustration. Typically, they're the complainants, because they will report back, well, they told me that as long as the animals have food and water, that there's nothing that can be done. Well, that's really not the case, because there was food and water in most of these situations. Now, the quality or quantity of food is certainly in question, and the environment is certainly in question, but we don't want to wait for something to become a crime before suddenly we say, oh, now we're going to do something about this. We also don't want to allow them just to surrender some animals and then look the other way. This could look like, oh, hey, listen, my boss is really upset about this. There's a lot of complaints out here. Can you just surrender those cats over here and I'll go away? Animal Services is notorious for trying to work within the resources that is being provided, and that's typically not enough. So in these situations, I can completely understand how it would be easy for you to say, you know, gosh, I don't have what I need, so I'll just let them surrender some of those animals and we'll call it good, because I can't take them all today anyways. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we're providing as much resource and addressing it from the initial problem all the way through into the future. The ASPCA actually had a program for many years called the Cruelty Intervention Advocacy Program. Say that 5 times fast. They called it CIA, so I liked it. But it was interesting because they had caseworkers, so social workers, whose job it was to maintain correspondence and communication with every single hoarding case. Sounds like a lot, but I'll tell you, it's a lot easier than going out there every year and taking 30, 40, 60, 100 animals and then not having resolution for them. So we also want to interrupt the cycle of abuse. The challenge here is that pictorially, you'll see in the picture on the left there, the cycle of abuse continues in the household. A new animal is acquired, and then the environment continues to deteriorate. They're kind of operating outside of their capacity for care, and to no surprise, it continues to deteriorate. However, unfortunately, there's nothing that stops this unless we do something different. It's very easy for them to acquire new animals. It's very easy for those animals to produce waste, make other animals, and ultimately cause greater harm to more animals. So that's why when we talked about prosecution not really being an effective tool in all of these cases, because we want to ultimately get their compliance. How many of you comply when you're being charged with something? Hopefully none of you have, right? But if you do, I mean, just watch a local episode of Cops. Many of you are not going to find people who are compliant after they find out they've been charged with something. They're immediately going to be frustrated, they're going to push back, and they're not going to provide you with the resources that you need. All right, so what does work? So there's a multidisciplinary, multi-agency response. We want to provide. When I worked for Lee County and started the state's first hoarding task force, we had the local community college, we had the state college, we also had the local behavioral mental health treatment facility, as well as EMS and fire, and we met regularly to discuss cases. And that's ultimately what it would take in order to get the resolution that you need, is to continue to provide the resource until that resource doesn't ultimately make the impact you're looking for, and then you have to resort to criminal prosecution. There is, interestingly enough, I don't have time to talk about it today, but there was a hoarding case that I ended up being able to completely rebuild their entire house. It was difficult to do. There's a home rehabilitation grant. If you've never heard of it before, HUD has a home rehabilitation grant program where if the hoarder makes less than 80% of the local median income, they could qualify. It's a non-repayment loan, so it means they don't have to make a monthly payment at all, but after they live in the home for 10 years, they forgive the debt. And so it was a way for us to completely rehabilitate and rehab this home. I'll leave you with a case example really quickly because I only have 5 minutes left. So this is one example of what not to do, but ultimately I had to clean up. So this was a case, this was Journey's End. This is Florence Theot on the left. Florence, she's now deceased. 2 years ago she passed, but she was 94 in this photo. And Florence said that her and her husband moved from England and they decided that they wanted to rescue the dogs in the woods and the animals that didn't have a home. Whatever that means, that's the mission. So what did she do? She brought in troves of animals. In fact, I even got complaints when I was still working at the ASPCA in 2012 about this. Volunteers were coming in, animals were not being provided care, or people were being injured, or employees were actually using the animal medications themselves, which is another issue. So you can kind of see the number of responses that we responded out, providing her order to provide care. Ultimately, we did have to execute a warrant at this property. But I wanted to show you just real quickly before I get in here, pictures can be kind of deceiving, right? This is the entranceway of the property. The deputy county manager was making monthly donations to this rescue. So imagine how hard it was for the new animal control director to come in and say, we got to shut her down. Relatively impossible. But she did not house the animals in cages. Her big thing was she wanted to let them roam freely. Or die freely, as I would describe. But this was the cat house. You can see sort of how the walkways were arranged and how they were moved about. I asked about cleaning and disinfection, and this is what I was pointed to. Everything is in the closet, and so you can imagine the level of cleaning and disinfection that was taking place. She would also hire individuals who couldn't get gainful employment otherwise, so they had substance abuse or mental health issues, and she would routinely just pick up random people and bring them into the shelter, which was her home, and they would live there. Unfortunately, during multiple inspections, we identified that they were using the controlled narcotics that some of the animals were being prescribed. It was quite a treasure trove of menagerie of animals. 150 total is what we found of mixed species, large animals, small animals, chronic medical conditions. This was a dog that actually had a severe injury early in life and actually walked on its forelimbs, which is not something that I had seen before. But ultimately why I wanted to bring this up is because I almost lost my job because of this case. New guy coming into the county trying to say, hey, this is serious, this is bad. Here are the photos. I've got volunteers and employees who are saying they're finding dead animals when they're changing out the filter for the AC unit. We need to do something about this. It wasn't until the sheriff and I were actually able to do multiple media interviews before he could then articulate that this was clearly criminal and that we needed to move forward with prosecution. But ultimately, the state decided that a 94-year-old lady doesn't have any harm to the community, and they decided ultimately not to charge her. So no charges whatsoever. And then for her, this was the local dog parade in DeLand. If you've ever been to DeLand, Florida, it's the U.S.'s largest dog parade. So if you ever go, they have a vehicle, and you can donate to them because they're still open today. So what I will say is it's been a pleasure to chat with you. I know that I'm probably past time, but if I can be a resource for you, feel free. That's my personal contact information there, and I would be happy to help in any way possible. Thank you.
Adam Leath, everybody. Awesome. Yes, he's here to chat. Hey, you're on break for 10 minutes, and then we enter into our very last session. 10 minutes. And remember, this is the last session that you can get any of the merchandise, the pet-friendly merchandise. So this is the last session to get any of those. And make sure that you do fill out your evaluation forms today, too. We actually do read those and look at those and consider everything you have to say for future events.